Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Last week, the U.S. Senate voted to give the military $716 billion for the year 2019, approving one of the biggest defense budgets in modern American history. Going through the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, observers believe the U.S. has shifted military focus from terrorism to China and Russia. Take a look.
Despite concerns from economists and lawmakers about the rapidly rising federal deficit, the 2019 military budget, approved by an 85-10 vote, gives America's armed forces an $82 billion increase from 2017. In the 576-page National Defense Authorization Act, China appeared 25 times. All of the passages echo with the key point illustrated in the U.S. national security strategy, in which the Pentagon expresses competition with China and Russia is a primary concern. In the report, China's technological companies are specified as concerns of U.S. national security. Though it didn't ban sales of Huawei and ZTE's products to the general public, the NDAA bars the purchase or use by the federal government and its contractors. Elsewhere, the bill tightens the exports of sensitive technology by issuing stricter guidelines for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. The bill also bans Pentagon from purchasing Chinese language instruction provided by the Confucius Institute. The legislation now goes to President Donald Trump, and at this pace, the defense bill could see passage ahead of the start of the next fiscal year on October the 1st. Many wonder how the U.S. defense strategy will affect future dealings between the White House and China.
For more on the National Defense Authorization Act from the U.S., with us here in Beijing studio, we have Mr. Zhang Junshou, Senior Captain, Vice President of the Naval Research Institute of China. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Beijing studio, General Zhu Chenghu, Chinese military expert and previously with the Defense Affairs Institute. Welcome, Mr. General. And in Washington, D.C., we have Brendan Mulvaney, who is the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. And in Boston, in the U.S. too, we have Jim Walsh, senior associate at MIT Security Studies Program. We have a very strong panel. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me begin by asking the two American guests with us. It seems this time both the legislative branch and the executive branch are pretty much look into each other's eyes and came up with this huge military budget. What exactly is behind this consensus? Mr. Walsh, briefly from you, sir.
Well, I think it's mostly politics. The president ran on the notion claiming that the military had been, quote, decimated. I have my real doubts about that, but that was his claim in the election. So one of his campaign promises was to spend more on the military. Republicans, going back to before Ronald Reagan, have always made that a priority. You'll notice that the vote in the Senate was rather lopsided. There were plenty of Democrats who voted for it, too. Why? Symbolic politics. The idea of a strong military communicating to voters that you yourself are strong. And so I think it's all about politics.
Well, Mr. Walsh argues it's all about politics. We see that the executive branch and the legislative branch not only seeing eye to eye, but also there's even an increase. Earlier, Mr. Mulvaney, you know very well, it's only more than $600 billion. But eventually, when it comes to number in the final document putting forward to the White House, it's more than $700 billion. Wow, quite an increase. What is that about?
Yeah, I think it was. I think he hit it right on the head. A lot of it is driven by domestic politics. But I also think it's an election year. People want to make sure that they're able to go back to their own congressional districts and say, hey, we got a little something extra for you. There was also a feeling before the 2016 election that because of sequestration, which was a bipartisan deal, but it was seen as under a Democratic president that the military had suffered under that. So it's an attempt to get back there. Secretary Mattis just recently came out and said we do not expect the 2020 version to be nearly as generous in the increase. So they know that it's only a 2-year kind of plus up this year and last year.
One of the things people pay attention to is what exactly is this military budget? Behind it, what is this idea? a lot of people talk about, Mr. Walsh, it is targeting more at China and Russia rather than terrorism. But that idea was beginning from the, in fact, the Obama administration, and therefore, is there anything new?
Well, I do think so, and the introduction, the report that your reporter gave, I think identified it, and that is to say, if you read the new National Defense Strategy, it clearly articulates, it says in very explicit language, that it's trying to do something different, that it's trying to move away from counterterrorism as the sort of fundamental pillar for national defense strategy and focusing more, as has been traditionally the case, on nation states, and in particular China and Russia. So that is very much the heart of the national security strategy, and that is reflected in this budget insofar as there's language targeting both Russia and China. So there has been a pivot here in the philosophy of the administration in terms of defining what the threats are, and they see the threats as nation states.
Right. Driving it back to nation state, well, that, particularly if you talk about China and Russia, reminds people of really the Cold War rhetoric. Mr. Mulvaney, I'm sure you experienced that period of time in history. Is this going to run into that danger?
No, I think there's a couple very fundamental differences. Certainly some of the rhetoric can sound like that, but I think there's a big fundamental difference in that neither China nor Russia today seeks the overthrow of the Western order and the United States government as it stands. The United States doesn't want to overthrow them, they don't want to, which is very different from the Cold War days of the Soviet Union that was seeking to spread through violent uprisings communism and eventually overthrow the United States. So we have tons of trade, we have good relationships with China through a whole a multitude of issues. We have a little bit of a trade dispute going on now, but if you look at the economic ties and the amount of interaction that's still going on, it's a far cry from the Cold War. So I think it's just a realization that after 10, 15 years of fighting the war on terrorism, we're no closer to a solution in Afghanistan, and it's time to go back to focusing on major state players.
I see. After our American guests help us to articulate what is really behind this idea of the more than $716 billion of military budget for the United States 2019, let's also invite our Chinese guest, Mr. Zhang Junshe and General Zhu Chenghu, sitting here in Beijing. Let's the five of us talk about this issue. General Zhu, you've been attentively listening to your two American colleagues. Your response to this shift of focus, so-called, toward China, toward Russia, by the U.S. defense budget?
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that the increase of the defense budget of the United States is intended against China. There is no doubt about it, because it is a continuation of later period of President Obama administration. I believe that this will continue in the future. But anyway, it's the business of the United States. And I think since the practice of the new defense strategy and the modification of its policies towards China, they need this money. They need the money to redeploy the forces. They need money to increase the capabilities of their navies. They need the money to increase the capabilities in the outer space. And they need money everywhere.
All right.
Therefore, I think it's understandable, so long as the U.S. National budget can undertake it.
Well, Mr. Zhang, also sitting here in Beijing, has they chosen the wrong enemy?
Of course.
Namely China?
Of course. They have been making an enemy out of China, because we know that China's national defense policy is defensive in nature, and we are carrying out active defense military strategy. We are not pointing at the United States as an enemy. We are just strengthening our national defenses against possible threats from outside. So I think the increase of the military defense budget of the United States maybe is out of its Cold War mentality and zero-sum game mentality, because the United States wants to achieve maybe absolute security from the other countries, and I think this is not a good phenomenon.
What would that mean to China? I wondered. After the U.S., if the White House would approve this bill, the highest ever in history when it comes to defense budget, and particularly clearly stating it is aiming at China, at least one of China. China is one of those targeting countries. What would that mean for China, General Zhu? Will China do the same, increase its military budget, and also try to be defensive about the fact that the U.S. is becoming ever more offensive against China?
Of course, we will have to be prepared for any worst scenario in the future. Number one, I think Chinese do not have the intention to race against the United States in arms, but we will have to be ready for the defense of ourselves. Secondly, I think we do not have the capability or intention to drive the Americans out of this region, but the Americans may believe that we have this intention, but I don't think we have the capability and the intention to do that. And I believe that in the future, I think it is there. That's the arms race between the two sides, even though Chinese do not want to race against the United States, because we are forced to do that.
I see.
And if you look at the situation, the military or security situation in East Asia and Asia Pacific, you can see we will have to seek chicken and egg, which comes first. Which side first provoked the races between us. So this is very important. So under such a situation, I think we Chinese will have to prepare ourselves for the worst scenario.
Is it a danger, arms race?
Absolutely, it's dangerous. But just as General says, I don't think China will carry out an arms race with any country, including the United States. We will just strengthen our defenses according to our plan and based on the real condition of our national defense capabilities. And I think from the U.S. side, maybe they are implementing the policy of America first and make America great again. So military first maybe is the foundation for the America first. And
wow, military first. I'm not sure about that. That sounds very much on the edge of a global war almost. I hope that is not going to be the case. But having said that, though, there are a lot of ideas floating around these days because we are at a critical juncture of change both in the Asia-Pacific region and worldwide. If you look at what the U.S. has been doing over the past year, for example, the U.S. strategy to confront China is often linked to the term Indo-Pacific strategy. Last December, when Trump released his national security strategy, the report accused China of seeking to, quote, displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, expand the reach of its state-driven economic model, and reorder the region in its favor. End of quote. On August 1st, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act. The bill says, as we discussed earlier, long-term strategic competition with China is a principal priority for the United States. 3 days later than that, at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo escalated the U.S. strategy toward China to more than just a war of words. He pledged $300 million to the Indo-Pacific to advance regional security and some of the other issues. Money number is only one thing, but certainly that indicated to an extent, Mr. Walsh, about the strategies behind all of these recent policy change. But the question is, where are these strategies driving us to? Are these strategies clearly thought out as a result of reality check, or these strategies are designed based on domestic politics, which is going to be absolutely dangerous? Mr. Walsh.
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. And I wouldn't, you know, I'm not a big fan of giant increases in the defense budget. A lot of this is just going to be pouring money down the drain. And I don't think the U.S. can sustain it year after year. Already we're starting to have debt problems because of the tax cut and other policies we've adopted. So I don't know how long that's going to last. So I wouldn't make too much of the spending on the military per se. I do think that the core of this is, can a rising China and a U.S. have a working political relationship? Now, is it natural for countries as they increase their wealth to have their ambitions increase? Yes, it is. That's what happens. And I'm sure China would prefer that the U.S. not be in Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. causing it headaches. That is natural for nation states to feel that way, and China, for its part, is, as its wealth increases, it's expanding its footprint globally. Again, something to be expected. Now, the question is, how do we handle this? Do we handle it politically? Do we manage it? Do we prevent conflict? Do we cooperate in some areas, even as we compete in others? Or do we let sort of things get away from us and somehow leading to a conflict? I'm a firm believer that this relationship can be managed. And so, yes, I'm concerned about it, but I wouldn't go too far off the diving board just yet.
Yeah, but General Zhu, there is this fundamental question, though, that we need to ask. That is, it seems that the Trump administration, since it came into power, it is very much keen on putting maximum pressure onto whoever it wants to negotiate with, or who it wants to take advantage of. That is just the strategy. But that strategy has backfired if you see the trade issue. Of course, we're not seeing the end of it yet. We don't know what is the result of exercising that strategy. But would this also indicate to China as a way that the Trump administration, together this time with the legislative branch, the Congress, using maximum pressure with huge increase toward China on a military issue, will that work, Mr. Zhu?
Well, if we look at the actions taken by Trump administration, we can see that the administration is putting huge pressure on China. I don't think it's Trump's decision. I think it's the bipartisan decision. So that shows that I don't think the trade warfare, trade friction will be limited only in the trade field. And it will be expanded to the financial and technological field as well as the military field. So with regard to the military field, I think there is competition here. And I think this sort of competition will continue. And maybe with the continuation of the competition between China and the United States, tension in this region may arise. For example, Korean Peninsula, across Taiwan, on South China, in South China Sea, etc. Of course, Chinese still hope to cooperate with the United States, and China take the United States as the Asian Pacific country, and especially in East Asia. They have huge interest here. We are not against, we have no intention to drive the Americans out. And this is our reality, and this is what we are doing. We do not have this intention, no capability either. So that's the business of the United States with its partners and allies. So it's beyond our business. Of course, if the military actions of the United States are intended to interfere into the internal affairs of China to provoke or challenge the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China, that's a different story.
I see. Mr. Mulvaney, I remember very clearly earlier you talk about the fact that this is not going to be a Cold War, so-called. But as your colleagues, both Chinese and American colleagues, have illustrated, what we have right now, even about trade, this has already backfired into many other areas. And you see maximum pressure when it's being used as a strategy. It could also become a symbol of what others could take as the U.S. want to spread the idea of Cold War to the other areas besides the trade. So that's just reality, what we are facing right now. No matter what Washington says, we're not doing Cold War, we are not interested in that, but this is what people read out of the actions. So, Mr. Mulvaney, I guess the biggest danger is not necessarily war, but all the process of building up to a war. So, how to contain risks? I think that is also an issue Washington needs to think very closely. When you think about the defense spending, when you think about your absolute strategy, whether in area of trade, military, or others, and Mr. Mulvaney, contain the risks. What is Washington thinking about this?
Well, I'd like to emphasize one thing right off the bat is I know our friends in China think that this revolves completely around them, and certainly they play a bigger role than they had in our national defense thinking for recent times. But this is against Europe. We have issues on the table with Mexico, our neighbor, one of our closest and biggest trading partners. So this current administration has taken a tough line. That comes from, I believe, the president's personal background of being a hard negotiator. So I know China feels that it's only against them, but we're taking the same line with our European allies. We've seen problems with Turkey, and again, it's across the globe. So I want to make sure that we recognize that although there are some tough stances being taken against China, it's not solely against China.
Yeah,
this
but you know,
the way this administration is operating.
my question is exactly related to what you just said, that this strategy. It is not just toward China, it's also toward other countries. But it doesn't mean that if it's targeting at China and other countries, the United States does not exercise a Cold War mentality. That could also mean the United States expand its Cold War mentality from China, from Russia to the other countries too. So my question is, when U.S. is exercising this mentality, is using this maximum pressure strategy, how the United States is containing risks. Not risks just with China, but risk with many other countries too. That's something Washington needs to legitimately think about when they try to take the actions. Mr. Mulvaney.
Well, again, I think maybe we have a different idea of what a Cold War mentality means. To most Americans, a Cold War mentality is when we've declared an enemy and we're using all resources of government to contain and constrain them. This is far from happening from anybody, including with Russia or China today. We have a lot of trade and economic relationships with them, which we didn't have with the Soviet Union. We have cultural ties, we have tourism, things like that. What we've done is we've taken a tougher stance because this is the president's approach to things in order to try to come up with a new way of approaching some problems that we faced or challenges that he was not happy with. Now, I agree, it's a new road, it's untested. People around the world are unsure what it means or what the outcome will be. I can't say for sure that it will be successful or unsuccessful. So there are some risks and some challenges posed with taking this new course. But I think the example of North Korea, we had some very, very tough rhetoric, far tougher than anything that we've expressed toward China. And then the president sat down with Mr. Kim and came to some sort of agreement, and we'll see how that pans out in the future. So is it tough? Yes. Are there some risks involved? Yes. But perhaps there's some rewards or solutions that would not have come about otherwise. I understand wholeheartedly why China is concerned about it, but we have to make sure we take it into a broad context.
Right. Understanding what China is thinking about is one thing. Of course, the United States needs to be responsible for itself, but the question is whether the United States is doing exactly the actions responsible for itself. That is also a big question because we're pretty much in an interlinked world as we speak. Mr. Zhang, also coming to you, as our American friend dismissed the possibility of the so-called starting a Cold War against China. But the question really is, I insist on that question, is the Trump administration and the Russian apparatus trying to start a Cold War or some kind of a war with the rest of the world? Will that work from your perspective?
Well, first I want to say that I agree with my American friends that the situation currently is very much different from the Cold War situation.
Traditional Cold War.
Yeah, traditional Cold War. So after 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we can see many Chinese see that actually the United States is making enemy out of China. The mindset of the decision makers of the United States are full of Cold War mentality because they have actually regarded or taken China as one of the main national security threats. They have changed from the terrorism to the nation states. And China is the first priority target of the United States. And they have taken very harsh actions militarily, economically, financially toward China. So this makes many Chinese think that the United States actually is waging a Cold War.
All right.
Actually, what Brandon mentioned could be changed in a short period of time. Even in the matter of week time, night time.
What do you mean?
I mean, the things we are facing are not the manifestation of Cold War, but all these sort of things could be changed.
Sometimes, just with some small twist of politics, things could really get us to some place that nobody wants to go at this moment.
Such as tourism, etc.
We'll see.
Yes. Yes.
how things will go from here. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. I really learned a lot from the four of you. Zhang Junshe, Zhu Chenghu, Brandon Mulvaney, and Jim Walsh. Thank you. Really appreciate it.